Okay, so you sent over some articles about tariffs,
Yeah.
and I got to say, I'm really interested in diving into this with you.
Yeah.
It feels like it's something that we hear about constantly,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm.
but getting a grasp on how they actually work and how they've been used historically,
Right.
I think is where we can really cut through the noise.
Yeah.
Um, so in this deep dive, we're going to explore tariffs, and we're going to focus particularly on how they've been used throughout history
Okay.
and look into the potential long-term benefits drawing from the articles that you shared.
Sounds good.
And just for our listeners who might not be totally familiar with this, at the most basic level, a tariff is just a tax
Mm-hmm.
that is applied to imported goods.
Right. Exactly.
It's a simple definition, but the impacts can be anything but simple.
No, they're not. It's a seemingly simple tool, but it can create some really complex, widespread effects. And one of the things that I think is so interesting to think about with tariffs is that they've been used in so many different ways throughout history
Uh-huh.
with very different results.
Yeah, well, let's start with a recent example to kind of ground us.
Okay.
You pointed to the Biden administration's actions in May 2024.
Yeah.
What were the specifics of those tariffs?
Well, in May 2024, the Biden administration increased tariffs on a number of imports from China.
Okay.
Specifically, they targeted things like solar cells and lithium-ion electric vehicle batteries,
Oh, wow.
steel, aluminum, and medical equipment.
Okay.
And it's worth pointing out that these aren't changes that happen overnight.
Uh-huh.
They're actually being phased in over a number of years.
I see. So what was the thinking behind these tariffs?
Well, according to the sources, the main goals seem to be twofold.
Okay.
One is to address what the U.S. considers to be unfair trade practices by China,
Yeah.
and the other is to give a boost to certain domestic industries within the United States.
Gotcha. So the basic idea is to make those imported goods more expensive so that American-made alternatives become more appealing.
Exactly. That's the immediate logic.
Okay, now let's take a step back in time and look at how tariffs have been used historically.
Okay.
You mentioned President McKinley and the Dingley Act in the 1890s.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So this period really highlights the protectionist thinking behind using tariffs.
Okay.
And it's really interesting to see how it kind of mirrors some of the debates we're having today.
Mm-hmm.
President William McKinley was a big believer in using tariffs to shield American industries from competition from overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example of this is the Dingley Act of 1897.
Okay.
The main goal there was to protect these new American manufacturing industries from cheaper goods coming from other countries.
Okay, and what were the results of the Dingley Act? Did it actually work?
You know, like a lot of these big economic policies, the results were kind of a mixed bag. In the short term, the domestic producers in those protected industries, they did see some relief from the competition from overseas.
Uh-huh.
And that could have made it easier for them to invest in those sectors.
Okay.
But this protection also had downsides.
Okay.
Consumers had to pay higher prices for goods because there wasn't as much competition from foreign companies to keep prices down.
Right.
And the articles also mentioned that there was a pretty big political backlash.
Yeah.
These higher prices even played a role in later elections.
Interesting. So even though some domestic industries might have benefited in the short term, the overall impact was more complicated
Yeah.
and definitely not all positive.
It really shows how tricky it is to find that balance between protecting specific industries and making sure the economy as a whole is doing well.
Right. So even in what some might consider a successful case of protectionism, there were real trade-offs.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to a kind of a cautionary tale. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. That one has a pretty bad reputation.
No, it does. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 is probably the example that people bring up the most when they talk about how tariffs can really backfire.
Uh-huh.
This act put really high tariffs on tons of different imported goods.
Okay.
And the thinking behind it was kind of like with the Dingley Act to protect American jobs and industries, but this time it was during the Great Depression.
Yeah, okay, so that was the goal, but the actual impact was very different, wasn't it?
It was really unfortunate. Instead of helping the economy, Smoot-Hawley is widely seen as having actually made the global economic downturn even worse.
Wow.
Other countries quickly retaliated by putting their own tariffs on American exports.
Mm-hmm.
And that caused a huge drop in international trade. It
Yeah.
basically shut down global commerce at a time when countries really needed to be working together to recover.
Uh-huh.
I think what's really important about Smoot-Hawley is not just that it failed, but how it failed. It shows what can happen when you ignore how interconnected the global economy is. And that's
Hmm.
a lesson that's super relevant today when supply chains are even more complex than they were back then.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
So we've seen the downsides, but what about the potential upsides in today's world?
Okay.
If we implement tariffs now, what are the arguments for how they could actually help boost long-term business investment here in the U.S.?
Okay, well, that's where we try to take these lessons from history and think about what might happen in the future.
Uh-huh.
The articles you shared present a pretty balanced view.
Hmm.
They talk about both the potential benefits and the possible risks.
Okay.
So on the positive side, the argument is that tariffs can actually create a better environment for domestic industries to invest for the long term.
Okay.
The idea is that if you protect these industries from what are seen as unfair competitive practices,
Uh-huh.
they'll feel more secure in expanding their operations and hiring more workers.
So if they're not facing as much of a threat from cheaper imports, they'll be more likely to want to grow here.
Exactly. Think of it like a price floor for the domestic producers.
Okay.
Suddenly, their foreign competitors' goods are more expensive,
Uh-huh.
so they could potentially make more profit at the same price.
Right.
That increased potential for profit then encourages them to invest
Okay.
in expanding production, upgrading their equipment, hiring more workers.
Okay, so it's about creating a more level playing field.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, tariffs can actually encourage companies to bring their production facilities back to the United States
Huh?
or to really expand the operations they already have here
Okay.
to avoid paying those import taxes.
Yeah.
And this reshoring, or nearshoring as it's often called,
Uh-huh.
could help revitalize local economies and create manufacturing jobs within the U.S.
Okay.
And the argument goes even further to suggest that this focus on domestic production that's
Yeah.
spurred by tariffs could also lead to more technological innovation
Mm.
and the development of more resilient and efficient domestic supply chains.
Okay.
It could even attract foreign investment into really cutting-edge sectors in the U.S.,
Okay.
like advanced technology and clean energy.
So there's this vision of tariffs leading to a stronger and more innovative economy here at home.
Exactly.
But we know there are arguments against that.
Yeah.
What are the potential downsides for long-term business investment?
Well, the potential negative impacts are pretty serious, and as we've seen, they kind of echo some of the things that happened in the past.
Uh-huh.
One of the most immediate and widespread consequences is probably going to be higher prices for consumers.
Right.
If imported goods become more expensive because of tariffs,
Mm-hmm.
consumers won't have as much money to spend,
Uh-huh.
and that can actually hurt overall demand in the economy
Okay.
and potentially limit any positive effects from business investment in other areas.
And what about the risk of other countries retaliating with their own tariffs?
That's a big one. As we saw with Smoot-Hawley, tariffs can quickly lead to a kind of tit-for-tat situation where other countries put tariffs on U.S. exports.
Well-
This creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses,
Mhm.
especially those involved in international trade.
Yeah.
And it can make foreign companies less likely to invest in the U.S.
Oh.
if they see it as an unreliable trading partner.
Right.
These trade tensions can also mess up global supply chains, making things more expensive and difficult for U.S. manufacturers who rely on imported components.
Right.
So it might actually become less attractive to invest in U.S. production.
So it sounds like multinational corporations with these complicated global supply chains might be hesitant to invest more in the U.S. in that kind of environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For companies that operate in multiple countries, tariffs make things a lot less predictable.
Uh-huh.
They might not want to make big long-term investments in the U.S.
Yeah.
if they're not sure what's going to happen with trade policies or if they think there could be more disruptions to their operations that cross borders,
Okay.
especially in industries that are really globalized, like technology, automotive, agriculture.
It seems like whether tariffs actually work to encourage long-term business investment here is really up in the air.
Mhm.
It depends on a lot of things outside of our control and how they're implemented.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that for tariffs to actually boost investment, they need to be part of a bigger economic strategy.
Mm-hmm.
if they're combined with things like incentives for innovation,
Okay.
tax policies that encourage investment,
Yeah.
and a stable and predictable regulatory environment,
Yeah.
then they might have a better chance of working.
Uh-huh.
But if they're just seen as protectionist measures that start trade wars and create problems with supply chains,
Right.
they could actually hurt the very investment they're supposed to help.
So looking at everything we've discussed,
Hmm.
what's the main takeaway about how effective tariffs are, both historically and today?
I think the bottom line is that tariffs have a really mixed track record.
Uh-huh.
There's always this balancing act between trying to protect domestic industries
Right.
and the very real possibility of negative consequences, like retaliation from other countries,
Mm-hmm.
and higher prices for consumers, which is really important.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer to whether tariffs are good or bad.
Okay.
It really depends on the specific situation, how they're implemented, and what the global economy is like at the time.
Okay, so for everyone listening, we've taken a deep dive into the world of tariffs. We started with the basics,
Mm-hmm.
their taxes on imported goods.
Right.
And then we looked at the tariffs the Biden administration recently put on certain Chinese imports.
Yeah.
The goal there is to address trade imbalances and support U.S. industries.
Uh-huh.
We then went back in time to look at McKinley's Dingley Act,
Mm-hmm.
which showed us that even when protectionist measures seem to work, there can be significant downsides.
Right.
And then we talked about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act,
Right.
a really clear example of how bad things can get when countries start retaliating with tariffs.
Yeah.
Finally, we discussed the complicated relationship between tariffs and long-term business investment in the U.S.
Hmm.
We look at the arguments for how tariffs could encourage growth here at home,
Uh-huh.
and also the real risks of higher costs, trade wars, and disruptions to those really important supply chains.
Yeah.
As we've seen, it's not at all clear whether tariffs are effective or not.
No, it's not.
So with all of that in mind, what do you think is the most important factor in determining whether tariffs will actually lead to those long-term benefits that some people are hoping for?
That's a really good question. Is it about choosing the right industries to target? Mm-hmm. Or is it more about how other countries react?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's about how well these tariffs fit into a bigger overall economic plan for the U.S.
Those are the key questions, and they really highlight that this is an issue that's constantly changing,
Yeah, it is.
and one that we need to keep a close eye on and think carefully about.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of just how complicated tariffs are.
I hope so.
Thanks for listening.